Chapter 5. Mr. Marble was paying. He was paying by the feeling of weary misery from which he suffered as he walked home that day across London Bridge, as he stood exhausted in the train, and in the bus which brought him from the station, and as he sat in the back room at 53 Malcolm Road. It was a new habit, this, of sitting in the tiny drawing room instead of the dining room. In the drawing room the light was bad and the furnishings even more dreary than in the dining room, while the fact that it was in the dining room that during the winter they had their fire had habituated the family to passing all their time there. But Mr. Marble now sat in the drawing room. He did little enough there. He read, it is true, in the books that he now chose regularly from the free library, crime books, even the interminable Lombroso, but he only read at intervals. Quite half the time he spent in looking out of the window across the barren flowerbed. That way he felt more comfortable. He did not have to worry then in case some stray dog from one of the neighboring houses were there. Mr. Marble had read how dogs are employed to find truffles in Perigord, and he was afraid. There were in addition various children from neighboring houses who had been known to climb into the garden after balls which they had knocked over. They had left off doing that now. Once upon a time Mr. Marble had not shown any active objection, but 2 or 3 times lately he had caught them at it, and had rushed out in blind, wordless fury. The children had seen his face as he mouthed at them, and that experience was enough for them. Children know these things more clearly than do their elders, and they never came into Mr. Marble's garden again. The neighbors were at a loss to understand Mr. Marble's jealous guardianship of his garden. As they said, he never grew anything there. Gardening was hardly likely to be a hobby of a man with Mr. Marble's temperament, and the garden of number 53 had always been in its barren weediness an unpleasing contrast to those near it. It gave at least some cause for a feeling of superiority to the neighbors. They all thought Mr. Marble unbearably snobbish. He sent his children to secondary schools, on scholarships, it is true, and after some years at public elementary schools, while their children began to work for their livings at the age of 14, and he wore a bowler hat, while the neighboring menfolk wore caps. They none of them liked Mr. Marble, although they all had a soft corner in their hearts for Mrs. Marble. Poor thing, he treats her like the dirt beneath his feet, he does. It was a comforting feeling that this monster suffered from the same troubles as they did, and was at times unable to pay his rent, even as they, for so the collecting clerk told them. Mr. Marble spent the evening sitting in the drawing room of 53 Malcolm Road. On his knee was the last of the free library books on crime. It was very interesting, a handbook to medical jurisprudence. Until he had begun it, Mr. Marble did not know what medical jurisprudence was, but he found it more and more absorbing. The period spent in gazing out of the window grew shorter and shorter as he read all about inquests, and the methods for discovering whether a dead body found in the water had been put there after death or not, and the legal forms necessary for certifying a person insane. Then he passed on to the section on toxicology. He read all about the common domestic poisons, spirits of salt, lead acetate, carbolic acid. From these the book proceeded to the rarer poisons. The first ones mentioned, perhaps given pride of place because of infinitely superior deadliness, were hydrocyanic acid and the cyanides. The comments on the cyanides were particularly interesting. Death is practically instantaneous. The patient utters a loud cry and falls heavily. There may be some foam at the lips, and after death the body often retains the appearance of life, the cheeks being red and the expression unaltered. Treatment. But Mr. Marble did not want to know anything about the treatment. Anyway, it was easy to see that there would rarely be an opportunity of treating a sufferer from cyanide poisoning. Besides, he did not want to read the book at all after that. It made his stupid heart beat too fast again, so that he had difficulty in breathing while his hand shook like the balance wheel of a watch. And the book had started an unpleasant train of thought that set him once more gazing out into the garden, only at twilight now, at the end of the day, while he thought about blank horrors. He knew much more about crime now than when he had first become a criminal. He knew that 9 murderers out of 10 were only discovered through some silly mistake. Even if they were very careful about planning the deed and carried it out successfully, they still made some ridiculous blunder that betrayed them. But in some cases they were found out by some unfortunate mischance. It was generally through the gossip of neighbors, but sometimes it was through the insatiable curiosity of some really uninterested person. Now Mr. Marble could rely upon there being no gossip. No one knew that young Medland had come to his house that night. And he had made no blunder. It was only some event beyond his control that could betray him. Such as? The answer came pat to mental lips, someone else moving into the house after he had been turned out, someone with a taste for gardening. Come what may, he must not be turned out of 53 Malcolm Road. But he might be at any minute now. His tortured mind raced like a steamship propeller in a rough sea. Supposing the franc should fall. He would lose his money, but that would be only part of his loss, and the least part, too. For Saunders would complain about his loss, perhaps even to the management of the bank, certainly in a way that would come to the ears of the authorities. Then Marble would lose his job, not possibly, but certainly. Then, a few weeks of grace perhaps, and then, rent unpaid, out of the house he would go. After that it was inevitable. Mr. Marble shuddered uncontrollably. It all depended on the franc. One part of Mr. Marble's feverishly active mind began to toil once more through all the data accumulated that had made him decide that the franc would rise. Another part began to regret bitterly that he had ever entered into such an absurd venture, rashly leaving his temporary safety, which already he began to long for again, in a wild search for permanency. Perhaps this was his blunder, like Crippen's flight to the continent. Perhaps it was because of this that he was going to be hanged by the neck till he was dead. That other book, the one about famous criminals, had been disgustingly fond of that expression. Mr. Marble shuddered again. Mr. Marble sat till late that night. Indeed, he sat until early the next morning, disregarding, hardly hearing the appeals of his wife, working out with one part of his mind the chances of the rise of the franc, with the other the chances of escaping detection. Mr. Marble found some ghoulish details at the end of the handbook to medical jurisprudence, which interested him as well as appalled him. They dealt with the possibilities of identifying bodies after prolonged burial. At 7:30 the next morning, Mr. Marble, who was already awake, he hardly seemed to sleep nowadays, heard the newspaper pushed through the letterbox of the front door downstairs. He climbed out of bed and padded down barefooted and in his pajamas. The house was very still, and it seemed as if the beating of his heart shook it. It was unfortunate that it should start again now when it had taken him all the time he was in bed to quiet it down. But there was no help for it. Mr. Marble wondered whether the paper had anything to say about the franc, and of course that was enough to start it. With the fiber doormat scratching his bare feet, Mr. Marble stood and read the financial columns of the newspaper. It was unenlightening. It mentioned the closing price of the franc, 118, 1 point better than he had bought at. Mr. Marble knew that already. Nowhere was there any mention of drastic action by the French government. Everything seemed as it was yesterday. Mr. Marble realized that he might perhaps be able to get out of the transaction even now with safety and a small profit. That would perhaps keep Saunders' mouth shut. But Mr. Marble only dallied with the idea for a moment. Then his eyes narrowed and his weak, nubbly chin came forward 1/8 of an inch. No, he would stick it out now. He would carry the business through, cost what it might. He was sick of being afraid. There was some quite good stuff in the make-up of Mr. William Marble. It was a pity that it took danger of life and death to stir him up to action. Yet Mr. Marble was so anxious that he called up to his wife, "Aren't you ever coming down, Annie?" And he bustled hastily through his dressing and breakfast and rushed off to the city a good half-hour before his usual time. No one in the crowded railway carriage guessed that the little man in the blue suit perched in the corner, his feet hardly touching the floor, who read his paper with such avidity, was hastening to either fortune or ruin. Although perhaps a closer glance than ever Mr. Marble received might have raised some strange speculations, considering his white face and his tortured light blue eyes. He did not walk across the bridge from the station. Instead, he scampered, breathlessly. At the bank he hung up his hat and coat carelessly and dashed upstairs to the Department of Foreign Exchange. The few clerks already there stared in wonder at his unwontedly early arrival. Straight to Mr. Henderson's room went Mr. Marble, to that private sanctum which only he and Henderson had the right to enter. He looked at the tape machine. Fool that he was. Of course, there would be no quotations through yet. He might as well have stayed at home. He came back to his desk and sat down, making a pretense of being busy, though this was difficult to maintain, as the letters had not yet arrived. He waited for 20 minutes while the room filled with late arrivals of the one timetable and the early arrivals of the other. The customary din of the office began to develop. The telephones began to ring, and the clerks began to call to each other from desk to desk. Mr. Marble became conscious that young Netley was speaking into the telephone opposite. He knew from Netley's greeting to the unknown at the other end that he was talking to the exchange brokers in London Wall. "Yes," said Netley. "Yes, no, what really?" "No, I hadn't heard. Yes, yes, all right." Marble knew instinctively what he was talking about. "What's Paris now, Netley?" he asked. Netley was so full of his surprising news that he did not notice the coincidence, and also actually added the hated "sir." 99, sir, he said. "It's gone up 20 points in the night. They don't know why yet." Marble knew. He was right, of course. He had a good head for finance when he chose to use it. Henderson came in and passed through to his own room. Marble did not notice him. He was busy thinking. He was nerving himself to go on with the venture. If he sold now, he could give Saunders some £300 profit, enough to satisfy him most probably. Anyway, he was safe for a bit. Keeping in close touch with the market, as he naturally did, he could sell at the instant a decline seemed likely. But if he did what he had suggested to Saunders yesterday, sold out and then reinvested, he would be much less safe. A 10% drop would wipe out profit and capital as well, and Saunders would think he had been swindled. But all Marble's judgment told him that the rise was bound to continue. There was a huge gain to be made if only he was bold enough, or desperate enough, to risk it. Henderson appeared at the door of his room. "Mr. Marble," he said, "someone wants you." Marble went in and picked up the receiver. "Hello," he said. "That Mr. Marble?" said the receiver. "Hello, old bean, how's things?" said the receiver. It was Saunders. He had begun to regret his transaction of the previous day long ago, but he was determined on playing the game to the last. Marble might have got £400 out of him by some nefarious means, but he was not going to get a rise out of him as well. He would see the thing through to the bitter end. "Going well," said Mr. Marble. He had to pick his words, for Henderson was within earshot, and it would never do for him to know that he was acting in collusion with one of the bank's customers. "They've begun to rise," said Mr. Marble. "Look at your tape machine." Mr. Saunders was unable to retain an exclamation of surprised unbelief. "You can get out now with a bit of profit," said Mr. Marble. His tone was cold and sincere, as he was striving to make it, and carried conviction. "Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying," said Mr. Marble. "Doodle," said the receiver, as Mr. Saunders realized that this was his cue, and all his old gambling spirit came back to him. "Right. I think you're wise," said Mr. Marble, replacing the receiver. "That Mr. Saunders," said Marble to Henderson. "Bought some francs yesterday, lucky devil. Wants to sell and reinvest." In the outer office, the usual nerve-wracking bustle was at its usual height. Mr. Marble sat at his desk, where the letters had by now been put, and rallied himself. For nearly 5 minutes, he fought with himself before he could turn to the telephone at his elbow and give the necessary orders to increase Saunders' holding, and the risk as well. There was apparently no need to worry. Mr. Marble sold at 95. He bought again at 93. Half an hour later the franc stood at 87, and the risk was past. It is an old story now, how the French government had quietly appropriated other people's credits the night before, how the franc rose all day long, while puzzled exchange brokers racked their brains to explain the mystery, and cursed their gods that they had not foreseen this action and bought all the francs that their credit would stand. And all day the franc rose, as men who had been caught hurried in to cover their losses, as the German speculators who had been hammering away so joyfully gave up the struggle in despair, as the small investors who follow the movements of the market far to the rear came panting in to steal a slice of profit as well. The men in the office who only a few days before had been confidently predicting that the franc would go the way of the mark had already changed their minds completely and were now saying that it would climb to its pre-war value of 25 1/4. But Mr. Marble kept his head, just as he had kept it that fatal night when he knew that a single mistake meant ruin and violent death. The cold fear that had succeeded to the initial feeling of elated success vanished completely, and he was left calm, deadly calm. He watched the market with a fierce intensity. Once or twice it wavered, as the faint hearts took their profits, but each time it recovered, as it was bound to do with a genuine demand behind it. At 75, he resold and reinvested again, sitting lunchless in the office all day, so as to keep the business under his own hand, and when the franc touched 65, he sold out for good. It might well go a little higher, as indeed it did, reaching 60 for a brief space, but he had done all that was necessary and a good deal more. There was no need to work out the profit. He knew that already, counting with painful eagerness every penny that every point meant to him. He called to the department stenographer and began the official bank letter to Saunders reporting the progress made. "Dear Sir, in accordance with your instructions received today by telephone at 9:45 a.m. and 4:51 p.m. we have, and all the rest of the business." It was cold and dry and formal enough, heaven knew. Bank letters are usually cold and dry and formal, even when they embody a paean of praise. This one told, with an air of supreme detachment, how Mr. Saunders had originally bought rather more than 45,000 francs with the 4,000 pounds represented by his margin of 400, how they had been sold at 95, and then represented nearly 5,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds profit, how this 1,000 pounds, and the original 400, had purchased francs at 93, and thus, thanks to the fact that each pound did the work of 10, controlled nearly 1,000,000 and a quarter of francs. This million odd had been sold at 75, bringing in 16,000 pounds and more. Mr. Saunders' profit now stood at over 4,000 pounds, and it and the good old original 400 had gone back once more into francs, purchased at 75 still, thanks to Mr. Marble having taken advantage of an eddy in the market. 45,000 pounds worth of francs did that sum control, 3 millions of francs and a few thousand odd ones. When they were finally sold at 65, Mr. Saunders' credit balance stood at a paltry 51,000 pounds. He probably was unable to do the simplest sum in foreign exchange. At the moment he did not have the least idea of what profit he had made. Marble's forethought had earned it for him. Most of the money would come eventually out of the pockets of less fortunate speculators, which only served them right, but some would come from the myriad firms which had to have francs at any price. Above all, if the bank had had anything to say in the matter, they would probably have cut short the speculation at the earliest opportunity, but they had never been consulted after the first interview. Mr. Marble had a specious plea of justification for having done all this on his own responsibility, in that Henderson had acquiesced in the first expansion of the deal, but he did not think he would have to use it. No bank really objects to having its clients enriched by the enthusiasm of its staff. When the letter was finished, Mr. Marble slipped out of the office. He had done no work that day, and he would not have been able to even if he had tried. He was too exhausted by the emotional strain under which he had been laboring all these hours. Instead, he walked quietly round to Saunders' office. The hurrying crowds round him, hastening to catch the 5.10 at Fenchurch Street or the 5.25 at London Bridge, did not pay him the tribute of a glance. They did not realize that this shabby man in blue was a capitalist, a man possessed of over 10,000 pounds, if he could be sure of making Saunders pay up. They paid no heed to him, save to shoulder their homeward progress. He was rich almost to the full extent of his wildest dreams, and yet they pushed him into the gutter. Mr. Marble did not resent it. They had likewise paid no heed to him when he was only a murderer. Saunders in his office, the last race of the day over, was glancing through some trial totals of the day's figures when one of his two clerks showed in Mr. Marble. "Hello," he said, glancing up, "so you've made a bit?" Mr. Marble sank wearily into the chair indicated and took the cigarette that Saunders offered. "What did you get?" 6-1, asked Saunders. He was half joking, half serious. He had determined that Mr. Marble's final bait of yesterday of 3,000% was a mere piece of bluff. Obviously Marble had taken a chance and it had come off, and he, glad to see his money back, let alone with profit attached, would not press him too hard for the fulfillment of all his promises. "Don't know," said Marble. "Haven't worked it out like that. But the total comes to something like 50,000. "What?" gasped Saunders. 50,000? Or it's francs, I suppose you mean. "No," said Marble expressionlessly. "Pounds." "Do you mean it?" "Oh, of course I do. You'll get the official notification from the bank tomorrow." Saunders said nothing. Nothing in his limited vocabulary was equal to the situation. £50,000, said Mr. Marble, still expressionless, but bracing himself unobtrusively for the final effort. "Let's work out what my share of it is." It was astonishing to him to find that Saunders agreed without any difficulty at all. He would not have been surprised to find him refusing to render any account whatever. He could have retained the whole and nothing could have been proved against him. But Marble, when he feared this, allowed his fear to overbalance his estimation of several important items in Saunders' make-up. In the first place, Saunders was an honest man. In the second place, he was so dazzled by the magnitude of the profit that he did not grudge the fair share of the man who had earned it for him. In the third place, he was a bookmaker, and he was accustomed to handing over large sums on account of transactions of which no law in the United Kingdom took the slightest notice. "Rightio," said Saunders. "How much is it exactly?" 50,329 and a few shillings. Saunders hastily figured it out. Marble had done it in his head long ago. "I make your little packet come to £27,681. "Oh, and the 60 you gave me. I get 22,000 odd for myself. Not bad going for 3 phone calls." Saunders was trying to be offhand in the presence of this magician who could make thousands sprout in the course of a night. Actually, he was bursting with astonishment and curiosity. "When's settling day?" he demanded. "The money will come in soon. You'll have it in less than a week. Might be tomorrow, but I doubt it. The bank will let you know." "Right. I'll send you a check then. Your working agree with mine." Saunders was trying his best to be the complete businessman, although the largest check he had written in his life was for no more than £500, and that occasion still haunted him in his worst nightmares. "Very well, then." Mr. Marble rose from his chair. Mr. Saunders could restrain himself no longer. "Oh, sit down, man, and tell me how it was done." "No, we must go and have a drink to celebrate this. Let's make a night of it, up west somewhere." "Let's," but none of these things appealed to Mr. Marble, although the very mention of a drink set him yearning. "No," said Mr. Marble. "I have to push off home." And he went home too. Although Mr. Marble was possessed of £27,000, he spent his evening, as long as he was sober, sitting in a dreary little suburban drawing-room gazing out over a desolate suburban backyard, for fear lest some trespasser or some stray dog should find something out. Chapter 6. Mr. Marble arrived home one evening lighter of step and of heart than he had been for some time previously. Even when the shadow of the gallows lies across one's path, one cannot help feeling a little elated when one had just received and paid into a new account at a new bank, receiving the homage of a bank manager, the sum of £27,000 odd. Mr. Marble was done with speculation. The money, as he had decided in a serious conference with the bank manager, was all going into gilt-edged investments, save for £1,000 which was destined for the purchase of 53 Malcolm Road. Even with this deduction, Mr. Marble would be in the possession of the comfortable income of £1,200 a year, although, as the bank manager said deprecatingly, the income tax collector would have a fat slice out of it. So Mr. Marble hung up his hat in the hall with a freedom of gesture unusual to him, and marched briskly into the dining room to find his family assembled, still over the tail end of their tea. "You're early, Will," said Mrs. Marble, rising uncomplainingly to hurry the preparation of her husband's evening meal. So I am," said Mr. Marble, and threw himself down in the armchair beside the empty grate. It is a strange fact, but true, that Annie Marble's habit of saying the obvious did not get on his nerves. In that lukewarm wooing, 17 years ago, one of the things that appealed most strongly to Mr. Marble was the fact that Annie did not say unexpected things and that he never had to bother about entertaining her. Yet at the moment he had a little scene in his mind's eye that would startle her and interest her enormously, and he had been looking forward to it for days. "What about school, John?" he said. John leisurely drank tea before replying. It was his way. All right, said John. He did not use 3 words where 2 would do. Mr. Marble had guessed already that John would have little to say, and the idea pleased him, for he knew that his next words would force him into saying something more than usual. You'll be leaving at the end of this term, John, he said. John put down his cup with a slight clatter and stared at his father. Really? He said. Only 1 word this time. Somehow it irritated Mr. Marble. Yes. I shall be entering you for the college next term. Mr. Marble was doomed to disappointment. John said nothing for a while. He was too stunned to speak. Nearly 4 years at his secondary school had endeared the place to him, and he had begun to look forward to the alluring prospect of prefectship and colors. This cup had been rudely snatched from his lips, and he was to be sent to the college. Sydenham College was a public school, one of the second rank only, though this subtle distinction did not matter to John at that age, and there was no love lost between the secondary foundation and this lordly place, whose boys rode on motor bicycles and turned up their noses at the rest of humanity. It was this that made the sharpest appeal to John's dumb but sensitive little soul. At Sydenham College, he would be torn apart from the friends he had made during 4 long summers. He, too, would have to turn up his nose at Manton and Price and good old Jones, whose glasses were always bent the wrong way. He wouldn't, of course, but he realized this with a flash of prophetic insight. They would expect him to, and that would be just as bad. For the moment, John saw things very clearly. At the college, he would be received and treated like a secondary boy, and at the school there would be instinctive hostility towards him. He would not be fish, flesh, nor fowl, nor good red herring. Oh, say something, for goodness sake, said Mr. Marble, pettishly. Don't sit there staring like a stuffed dummy. John addressed his eyes to his plate. Thank you, father, he said. Confound it, boy, said Mr. Marble. Anyone would think you didn't want to go there. The finest public school in England, and you're going there. And here Mr. Marble threw his finest bait. If you get on well there and distinguish yourself, there might be that motorbike I've heard you talking about some day. But the effort was vain. Even a motor bicycle meant nothing to John if it was conditional upon his going to the college. If Mr. Marble had only mentioned it before he had mentioned the other, John's reception of the suggestions might have been different. As it was, John could only mumble, "Thank you" again and fidget with the crumbs on his plate. Mr. Marble turned from him, exasperated, and addressed his real favorite, Winnie, instead. And you, miss, he said, with a jocosity which, unwanted as it was, had precisely the opposite effect to the one he desired. What do you want most? It was an unsatisfactory question to put suddenly to an unprepared 14-year-old, even if she was nearly 15. Winnie thought and fumbled with her dress and looked away as she became conscious of the concentrated gaze of everyone in the room. To her aid came the recollection of what she most envied the biggest girl in her form. Green garters, she said. Mr. Marble roared with laughter, only the tiniest bit forced. You'll have a lot more than that, he laughed. We'll be buying you a new outfit altogether this week, lock, stock, and barrel. What do you say to going away to a nice school, a real young ladies' school, where as likely as not you'll ride a horse in the mornings, and have all the things you fancy, and be friends with lords' daughters? Ooh, I should like that, said Winnie, but it was only modified rapture. Mr. Marble had sprung his little surprise too surprisingly to have the effect he desired. But he was satisfied for the moment. But is this all true? Asked Winnie. Are we really all going to have just what we like? As true as true. We can have just whatever we like, said Mr. Marble, overjoyed to find Winnie at least impressed. Well, what's Mummy going to have? Continued Winnie. Mr. Marble turned to his wife, who had sat behind his shoulder, suddenly, when she heard this surprising conversation begin. Mr. Marble looked at his wife, and she began to think, confusedly, as always. Anything I want at all? She asked, more to gain time than from any other motive. Anything you want at all, repeated Mr. Marble. Mrs. Marble let her mind travel free, without hindrance from the straight limits of expense which had hedged it in all her life. And her thoughts flew straight, as they often did, to green fields and the sunlight in the hedgerows. With the clearness of mental vision so often granted to those of stumbling intellect, a picture rose before her mind's eye of a sunny, hyacinth-scented lawn, full of the murmuring of bees, sleepy little hills, half-wooded, in the distance. And Mr. Marble beside her, kind and a little attentive and lover-like. "Oh, do be quick, Mummy," said Winnie. Mrs. Marble translated her thoughts to the best of her ability. "I want a new house and a nice garden," said Mrs. Marble. Mr. Marble made no comment. He was so silent that in time they all turned and looked at him. He had shrunk back in his chair, literally shrunk, so that he only seemed to be half the bulk he had been when he came in. His face was blank, and his lips moved without uttering a sound. He rallied in the end. "You won't have that," he said. "You'll never have that." Then he guessed at the strangeness of his manner from their surprised expressions, and tried to mask it. "Houses are hard to get these days," he said. "And I'm sure I'm fond enough of the old home not to want to leave it. Can you think of something else, Mother?" Of course Mother could, if Will wanted her to. Discussion began in a more animated form as they warmed to the subject. Even John was in the end lured into joining in. Suggestions were bandied back and forth: furniture for the house, motor cars, theaters, chicken for dinner on Sundays. But somehow they all avoided mentioning the crying need the house was in for redecoration, and none of them suggested obtaining the assistance of a jobbing gardener to put some beauty into the backyard. 3 of those present did not know why. It was instinctive. As Mr. Marble recovered his good spirits, he became more jovial and friendly than the children could remember his being for years. They chuckled when he produced a big notebook and made a show of noting down all the suggestions offered. "But your tea's getting cold, Will," said Mrs. Marble. "Why don't you have it now and go on with the game after?" The children looked anxiously at their father. Was it after all just a game? It would be too bad if it were. But he reassured them at once. "It isn't a game, Mother," he said. "It isn't really." But still Mrs. Marble looked her unbelief. Half buried in her tangled memory, there were 1 or 2 recollections of times when her husband had cruelly taken advantage of her dimness of thought. And she was sensitive about it and shrank from having it exposed once more. "It isn't a game, Mother," said John and Winnie, encouraged. "I've just made a pot of money in the city," said Mr. Marble. "Father's just made a pot of money in the city," repeated Winnie. Gradually she came to believe them. "How much?" she asked, astonishingly more practical than her children. "More than you could guess," said Mr. Marble, adhering firmly to his article of faith that under no conditions should one's wife know anything about one's income, although this had once before brought him to the verge of ruin. "Enough to keep us all our lives," added Mr. Marble, rubbing it in. "But you're not going to give up the bank," said Mrs. Marble, aghast. You could feel that capital letter as she spoke. Awe for the vast institution which gave them their daily bread, and terror of the Damocles sword of dismissal which dangled always over their heads were ingrained into her being from the early days of marriage. "I don't know yet," said Mr. Marble easily. "I may and I may not." "Oh, Will, you mustn't really." "Supposing anything went wrong." "Wrong? What's going to go wrong?" Marble could not keep a suspicion of a sneer out of his voice. He was nettled at the suggestion that anything should go wrong with financial affairs under his control after his astonishing feat of manipulation of the franc. He did not make full allowance for the fact that Mrs. Marble knew nothing of this. That was perhaps characteristic, and equally so was his annoyance that she should interfere in the slightest with his control of their joint lives. "I don't know, but, oh, Will, you can't have made as much money as all that." "Can't I? I have." To children it seems perfectly natural that their father should come home one day and say that he has made all their fortunes, but to a woman nothing seems more unlikely than that the husband should say the same thing. It took a long time to convince Mrs. Marble. Indeed, by the time that this was done, Mr. Marble had lost all enjoyment. Nobody had been very enthusiastic. Nobody had told Mr. Marble what a very wonderful man he was. John, indeed, had seemed positively sorry that it had happened. And Mrs. Marble had said the deplorably wrong thing, as of course was only to be expected. Poor Marble's long-stretched nerves gave way, and he ended by losing his temper rather badly. "You're a lot of fools," he snapped. "As for you, Annie," Annie wept, and as always when that happened Mr. Marble could bear things no longer. He uttered an inarticulate noise which only inadequately conveyed his disgust, and rose indignantly from his chair. Then he went through a series of actions which Annie and the children had come to know all too well. He roamed round the room and picked up a couple of the eternal books on crime that lay about. Then he felt in his pocket for the sideboard key. He brought from the sideboard the decanter, the siphon, and the glass, and then with his arms full he passed out of the room. The children and their mother heard him go into the drawing room at the back, and they heard the door shut with unnecessary violence. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," wailed Mrs. Marble, handkerchief to her eyes. Then she rallied. It was still an article of faith with the Marble family that the head of the house did not drink, never had drunk, and 1,000 times never had been the worse for drink. And at the same time another article of faith had grown up lately. That was that Mr. Marble did not sit all those hours in the drawing room for any particular purpose. It was just a little whim of his, unaccountable, but not to be commented upon. "Now, children," said Mrs. Marble, determined at all costs, although she did not know why, to enforce these beliefs and at the same time to hold up the prestige of her husband, "get on quietly with your homework and don't make a noise to disturb father. Perhaps he'll tell us more about it when he's not so tired." She rose from the table and gathered up the tray on which still lay her husband's untasted tea. She went out quietly, tiptoeing past the drawing-room door. A good part of the evening she spent in washing up. The rest she spent in ironing. When at last she had done her work and had seen the children off to bed, she came and sat down quietly in the deserted dining room. She was very tired, and she was very worried. Of course, she believed dear Will when he said he had made all that money, but still, he might have made a mistake somewhere, and it might not be as he thought. She felt very frightened about his obvious determination to leave the bank. Not for all the wealth Will said he had made would she admit to herself that the main cause of her worry was the haunting suspicion that perhaps Will had made this money illegally. He might be taken away and put in prison. That would be terrible, but, of course, she would always love him and be true to him. Indeed, Mrs. Marble, thinking in muddled fashion, but doggedly as was her wont, decided that something like this must have happened. He had not really done anything wicked, of course, but there would be suspicions against him, and all the evidence would point that way, and so on. His recent anxiety, which even Mrs. Marble had guessed at, and his mutterings at night as he lay at her side all seemed to prove the same thing. Poor boy, he must be very worried. And the thought of his sitting there all alone in the half-dark drawing-room moved her to vast pity. All her queer love for him rose in her breast, and she felt her eyes growing moist. She loved him very, very dearly. It was because of this anxiety of his that he had not been as tender towards her as he had once been. But that would end now that he knew that she was on his side and shared his trouble. There was nothing in the world so dear to Mrs. Marble as the kisses of that little, shabby man with the reddish mustache, who bore the fires of hell eternally in his bosom. With her love welling up in her breast until it began even to oppress her, so that she had to rest her hand over her heart, Mrs. Marble came to the crossroads of her life, and did not even know that she had reached them. Without further thought she went out of the room, and quietly across into the other, bearing love and hope to her darling husband. He was sitting in the position that had become habitual, in the uncomfortable late Victorian armchair, facing the window and about 2 yards from it. His position indicated an awkward compromise between tension and relaxation. On the chair beside him stood his whiskey and his glass, and on his lap lay his book, as if he had interrupted his reading for a moment to follow some train of thought which had just occurred to him. But for the last hour nearly, it had been too dark to read. Mr. Marble was half drunk, and his mind was working out possibilities of unimaginable horror as he gazed out into the nearly dark garden which held his secret. "Dear," began Mrs. Marble, and then, as he did not answer, "Are you awake, dear?" She came nearer to him, walking like a gray ghost in the semi-darkness, and touched him lightly on the shoulder. Mr. Marble sprang into instant activity. He writhed in his chair, and the whiskey decanter went over with a crash, sending its scant contents gurgling out onto the carpet. What, he spluttered. After all, a man can be ready for all emergencies only for a limited time, and Mr. Marble had relaxed for once. Then he saw that it was only his wife. "Oh, it's you, you fool," he snarled, ashamed of his absurd fear. He would not admit to himself what he had been afraid of, and angry with her, with himself, and with everything else. "Oh, Will, I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Marble, stooping to pick up the decanter, her slippers sopping with whiskey. A bare half-inch remained in the decanter. Mere mockery. Mr. Marble peered at it and swore. It was an ugly word he used, and Mrs. Marble drew her breath in sharply. But she still tried to make the peace. "Never mind, Willie boy," she said. "I couldn't help it. You can get some more in the morning." "Never mind, dear." They were the little pathetic words she used to use when John was a little boy, very near to her heart, and something had upset him. To Mrs. Marble's mind, the loss of his whiskey must affect Mr. Marble in the same way as did a broken toy affect baby John. "Never mind, dear," said Mrs. Marble, and she put out her hand to his forehead, just as she used to do. But Mr. Marble only pushed her away pettishly and growled out the ugly word he had used before. It was that upset Mrs. Marble. She was used to his fits of temper. She would not have loved him so dearly had he not had them, baby-like, but he had never sworn at her, never before. Still she made another effort, trying to get past his outstretched arm to touch his forehead and ruffle back the sparse hair in the way she loved doing. "That wasn't what I wanted to speak about, dear," she said. I hope to God it wasn't," sneered Marble. "You would be a bigger fool than even I thought you were if you came in here just to upset my whiskey." "Oh, Willie, Willie," sobbed Mrs. Marble. She was crying now. "Oh, Willie, Willie," mocked Mr. Marble, his nerves fretted red raw. "No, Willie, do listen. I wanted to tell you that I know about it, after all, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter a bit, dear. It won't alter me at all." She was able to say this long speech, long for her, that is, only through the inability of her husband to say or do anything. He had gripped the arms of the chair and was staring at her in terror. Then at last he spoke, or rather croaked. His throat was dry and his heart was pounding away in his breast like a steam engine. How do you know?" "I don't know really, dear, I just guessed." "But you don't understand, dear. It doesn't matter, that's what I wanted to say." Marble laughed. It sounded horrible in the darkness. "So you think it doesn't matter? A lot you know." "No, dear, I don't mean that. I mean it doesn't matter my knowing." "Oh, Willie dear." But Marble was laughing again. It was a wild beast sound. "If you could guess, half the world will guess tomorrow." Tomorrow? Don't they know now? Would I be here if they did, you fool?" "No, dear. But I thought perhaps they suspected." "There's nothing for them to suspect. They can only know." "But how can they know? If young Medland? Oh, you mean that young nephew who came here. Did he help you? I've often wanted to ask you about him." Marble stared at her gray form in the twilight. He could not see her face, and he felt a horrid fear that either she was tempting him or else he had lost his unassailable position for a silly nothing. For a moment the first idea triumphed. "You devil," he said. "What are you doing? What are you asking me this for?" His voice cracked with fear and passion. Mrs. Marble said nothing. She was too startled to utter a word. Mr. Marble stared at her unmoving figure, and for a moment a wild, ridiculous fear of the unknown overwhelmed him. Was it really his wife, or was it? Blind panic began to overmaster him. He struck out wildly at the brooding form. He felt a savage pleasure as his fists struck firm flesh, and he heard his wife give a startled cry. He struck again and again, heaving himself up out of his chair to do so. The little chair fell over, and the glass and the siphon broke into 1,000 clattering fragments. His wife screamed faintly as he followed her across the room, hitting with puny savagery. "Oh, Willie, don't." Then chance directed a blow more accurately, and Mrs. Marble fell dumbly to the ground. Marble staggered and clutched the back of a chair to steady himself. As his panic passed, he was only conscious of a dreadful weakness. He could hardly stand, and he was dizzy with strain and with the pounding of his heart. There came a clattering outside the room, and then the door was flung open. The light from the hall lamp outside streamed in, revealing John standing by the door in his ragged nightclothes. His mother lay where she had fallen, close at his feet. For a second father and son stared at each other. It was only for a second, but that was enough. At the end of it, John knew that he hated his father, and his father knew that he hated his son. John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Then his mother at his feet sighed and stirred. Mr. Marble recovered himself with an effort. Oh, those efforts. "Glad you came down, John," he said. "Your mother's had a bit of an accident. Help me upstairs with her." John said nothing, but he bent and put his arm under her shoulders, while Marble held her at her knees. Between them, they dragged her upstairs. She was conscious and well enough to walk up herself by that time, but a frozen silence lay on all three of them, and none of them would break it. They laid her on the bed, and Mrs. Marble wailed and dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, which she still held clutched in her hand. John looked once more at his father, with a flash of hatred still in his eyes, and then he swung round and walked out of the room. Perhaps even then all might have been well if Mr. Marble had bent over his wife and had asked her pardon, in the little soft voice that he had sometimes used, which Annie loved so well. Annie might have softened. With her arms about his neck, she might have pulled him down to her, and her broken-hearted tears might have changed to tears of joy even at that late moment. But Mr. Marble did not do this. He was badly flustered and shaken. He stepped back from the bed and fidgeted round the room. When at last he came back to her, Annie had her face buried in the pillow, and she shook off the hand he tentatively rested on her shoulder. Mr. Marble dallied for a moment, but before his mind's eye rose a vision of a little drain of whiskey left in the decanter downstairs. There was still a little left. He had seen it with his own eyes after Annie had picked up the decanter from where she had knocked it. And whiskey at that moment was what Marble needed more than anything else in the world. He turned and tiptoed out of the room, downstairs to where the decanter was. Late that night, Mr. Marble still sat in the drawing room. He had lighted the gas, because he did not like the darkness he had found down there. His hand gripped an empty glass, and his eyes stared across the room as he sat in the armchair, faintly visualizing the sequence of events his overactive mind was tracing out. Too little whiskey and too much excitement had stimulated Mr. Marble's brain to such an extent that he could not check his wild imagination at all. The consequences of the evening's work were presented to him in every possible variation. At one second, he seemed to feel the hands of the police on his shoulders, the next, and he could feel the hangman's slimy fingers upon him as they writhed over him, making all ready. More than once he started from his chair, mouthing a stream of inarticulate entreaties. Each time he sank back with a sigh, only to be plunged immediately afterwards into some other horrible fantasy. He had cut the ground from under his feet. He had made the blunder that every murderer had to make. His secret was shared, and a secret shared was a secret divulged. That fool Annie would never bear the strain he felt so hard. She would let fall something, and then the ghastly fancies recommenced. What Mr. Marble needed was whiskey, quantities of it, so that he could drown all these maddening thoughts. But whiskey was just what Mr. Marble could not have. Not all his £27,000, no, not all the wealth imaginable could buy whiskey for Mr. Marble at that time. In London it might have done, but not in that quiet suburb at 1 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Marble could only sit yammering in his chair, tormented to madness. Chapter 7. Mr. Marble was, of course, deceiving himself when he imagined that his wife could deduce all that had happened from his half-hearted exclamations that night. He realized this as time passed. She could do nothing of the sort. The situation between them was still strained. They said as little to each other as they could help, but it was not because Annie knew her husband for a murderer. Mr. Marble gradually regained his peace of mind in that respect. And other things were too exciting for him to brood over it just at present. As he had expected, Mr. Saunders had been unable to keep to himself the glorious fact that he had brought off 100-to-1 success and had acquired the highly respectable sum of £24,000. In 2 days the news was all over the city, and in 3 it had been brought to the official notice of the bank. There had been a slight scene, in which Mr. Marble bore himself with the arrogance only to be expected of a man with a fortune at his back. The bank suspected the worst, told him more in sorrow than in anger that they would not prosecute this time. They had no case anyway, and furthermore they would not expose their office routine to comment in a court of law, and then accepted the resignation that he tendered with a sigh of relief. Yet Mr. Marble did not become at once a gentleman of leisure. A distinguished firm of foreign exchange brokers heard Saunders' story and decided that a man of Mr. Marble's talents would be a desirable acquisition. The only man in all the city who had foreseen the rise of the franc and who had had the courage of his convictions to put all his savings into the speculation, and who, besides, had the force of character to inveigle Saunders into supporting him would be a man worth having. So they approached Mr. Marble and made him a tentative offer which, with little debate, he already had a vague idea that the more his thoughts were occupied the better, he accepted. The hours were easy. The junior partner was a little hesitant in mentioning the amount of the salary, $500 a year. So Mr. Marble found himself in a comfortable position with no less an income than £1,700 a year. He struggled hard to stop himself from thinking about the fact that all this splendor was entirely due to the fierce stimulus of being in danger of the gallows. The freehold of 53 Malcolm Road was safely purchased. It was only a matter of 3 days' negotiations, for the owners were overjoyed to find someone willing to pay £700 for a house which cost £20 a year in repairs and yet was not allowed by law to be rented at a greater sum than £35. Mr. Marble could afford to live in a house 3 times as expensive. But he could not bring himself to leave the place. He could not bear the idea of taking his eyes from that garden. Besides, he had a vague apprehension that there might be legislation compelling all owners of unoccupied houses to let them, and then the state of affairs which his tortured imagination so constantly pictured would naturally develop. No, he could not bear to leave the place, and so Mr. Marble, with an income of £1,700 a year, continued to live in a shabby street, in a house with 2 tiny sitting rooms, 3 tiny bedrooms, and a kitchen whose size Mrs. Marble deplored every time she entered it. Poor Annie Marble! She could hardly realize all the changes that would take place. The first convincing proof that matters were radically different occurred in a week or 2 after that unpleasant evening in the drawing-room. Mr. Marble was leaving for town. He did not have to start until past 9 o'clock nowadays, and as he said goodbye at the door he reached into his pocket and thrust something roughly into her hand. "Here," he said, "take this and go out this morning and spend it, every bit of it. Mind you spend it all. There, goodbye." He dashed off up the road. Mrs. Marble looked wonderingly at what he had given her. It was a roll of notes, crisp and fresh from the bank. She passed them through her fingers. Some were £5 notes, and some were £1 notes. Altogether they amounted to an enormous sum, £50 in all, actually, and it was more money than she had ever seen together at one time. Mr. Marble, in the bus on the way to the station, felt a good deal more comfortable than he had done for the last 2 weeks. It had been rotten, not daring to meet his wife's eyes. She had a thin time, poor thing, and Mr. Marble knew from experience that one of the few slight pleasures in her life was being able to spend money. With £50 in her purse, she would be able to go down Rye Lane and have a high old time. Perhaps when he came back that evening she would be smiling again, and all that beastly business, when he had lost control of himself, would be forgotten. But even while he was thinking this, Mrs. Marble was turning those notes over with fear in her heart. At that time her husband would have given her more pleasure by an unexpected gift of 5 shillings. For 5 shillings does not set one thinking of police and prisons. Besides, Mrs. Marble hardly knew what to do with £50, and lastly she had too great a fear for the future to spend it all at once. Muddle-headed she may have been, but in her life Mrs. Marble had learned one lesson, and that very thoroughly. It was to the effect that there is nothing as nice as money, nothing that goes so quickly, and nothing that is so hard to obtain. Mrs. Marble went and locked it into the one private drawer she had in all the house. She went slowly through her morning's work. She still had no help, making the beds, turning out one room, peeling potatoes for the children's dinner, and then she put her hat on to do her usual day's shopping. In the hall she hesitated for a moment, and then she yielded. Hurrying upstairs, she unlocked the drawer and guiltily peeled off one single £1 note and thrust it into her purse. Mr. Marble returned home in time to join his children at their tea. As he came in he was obviously in good spirits, and Mrs. Marble brightened as she saw that this ultra-rare mood was on him. Mr. Marble looked round the room inquiringly. He put his head out into the hall again and peered up and down it. Then with much elaboration he began to search under the table and in all sorts of impossible places. "What are you looking for, Will?" asked Mrs. Marble. She could hardly help laughing at his antics. "I'm looking for all the things you bought today," was the reply. Mrs. Marble looked guiltily at her husband. "With that money you gave me this morning?" she asked. "That's right. I gave it to you to spend." "I didn't like to spend it all, dear. I only used a little of it." Mr. Marble took a gold cigarette case out of his pocket, chose a gold-tipped cigarette, lighted it with a match from a gold matchbox, and looked across at her with half-concealed amusement. "Well, what did you buy then? Come on, let's hear all about it." Mrs. Marble fumbled nervously with her dress. I bought one or two little things for the kitchen." "What were they?" A mop, dear, and 2 new pie dishes." Mr. Marble yelled with laughter. "Splendid," he said. "And what else?" "A new china pot for the aspidistra. Such a nice one, dear, but, of course, they're sending that. And a wing for my other hat, the black one, you know. And I don't think there's anything else." "Oh, don't laugh like that." I couldn't help it. But Mr. Marble only laughed the more. He rocked with merriment. He turned to the children and gasped out between his outbursts, "I give your mother £50 to go out and spend, and that's what she does with it. A mop and some pie dishes. Oh, Annie, you'll be the death of me one of these days." Even the children realized that it was vague bad taste on his part to hold their mother up to ridicule before them, and poor Mrs. Marble grew more and more flustered. "Oh, don't laugh, Will, don't. How was I to know that you really wanted me to spend all that?" But Mr. Marble did not continue the argument. "Tomorrow's Saturday," he said, "and I'm not going to the office. We'll go out together, and then I'll show you how to spend the money I give you. What about it?" "Oh, that would be nice, dear." Little Mrs. Marble was happily flustered now. It was perhaps a year since she had been out with her husband. It was probably 3 since she had been north of the Thames with him. And yet that morning to which she looked forward so happily through the night was not wholly successful. It was rather like a wild nightmare. They began in Tottenham Court Road at 10 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Marble began by making arrangements for having some old furniture removed from 53 Malcolm Road. Then he began an orgy of buying. Clearly, he was acting on some already matured plan of his own, for he went straight to the period rooms to make his purchases. But he did not want modest Queen and/or beautiful Chippendale. That sort of thing was not in his line. Instead, he demanded Empire furniture. They gave it him. In addition, they gave him furniture of the period following close after the Empire, massively gilt, and showing evident traces of the debasement of taste that flooded the world from the 40s onward. He bought over-gilded, over-florid chairs and couches. He bought an unsightly Empire bed ornamented with gilt cupids in hideous taste. His crowning purchase was a massive table, the frame carved and chased and tortured into a monstrosity of design, and then flamingly gilded. The body of the table was of marble mosaic, crudely arranged in feeble classical design. That table probably weighed between 9 and 10 hundredweight, and it looked like it. The manager of the department rubbed his hands as the bargain was concluded. He could not remember a morning like this since the palmy days of the war. He foisted a few more white elephants onto Mr. Marble, and then led them off in the direction of pictures and picture frames. And yet that manager did not feel altogether happy while making these arrangements. The business was too simple. It was too like taking advantage of the feeble-minded. He had only to offer the thing, name its price, and book the order. Even he, skilled as he was in the mentality of the furniture buyer, did not appreciate the fact that Mr. Marble was buying what he wanted to buy, not what the manager wanted him to buy. Mr. Marble was thoroughly enjoying himself. Those vast expanses of gilt, those florid designs like nightmare Laocoons, were to Mr. Marble's mind the perfection of good taste. As for the mosaic table, he considered himself lucky to have got hold of that. So rapidly did Mr. Marble make his purchases, and so little did he confer with his wife, that in 2 hours the whole business was completed. Mr. Marble signed a check that gave him possession of enough debased Empire furniture to fill 53 Malcolm Road to overflowing, and was bowed out of the shop by an amazed and delighted staff. On the pavement, Mr. Marble consulted the gold octagon-shaped watch on his wrist and hailed a taxicab. "Oh, Will," murmured Mrs. Marble in deprecating tones, but she got in. "Bond Street," snapped Mr. Marble to the driver and climbed in beside her. Mrs. Marble clung desperately to her husband's arm as they bowled along Oxford Street. She was half afraid lest he might suddenly disappear, as so frequently happens in fairy stories, and leave her alone in a taxicab. She had never been in one before. To find her way home and face the arrival of a house full of Empire furniture without the support of his presence. Mr. Marble made no objection to this public display of affection. He even pressed the timid arm that lay between his own and his side, thereby sending Mrs. Marble into the seventh heaven of delight. She was vaguely reminded of their honeymoon. They got down at Bond Street Tube Station and began to walk slowly down, their eyes on the shop windows. Mrs. Marble began to wonder what was going to happen next. She soon found out. "Go in there," said Mr. Marble, stopping outside a shop. Mrs. Marble glanced at the windows. The one or two articles displayed there proved without a doubt that it was a shop for women, and also that it was a shop for women with plenty of money. She clung to her husband's arm more wildly than ever. "Oh, I can't, Will, I can't. I don't like to." Mr. Marble snorted with contempt. "Get along with you," he said. "Go and buy what you want. 9 women out of 10 would give their ears for the chance." "Oh, but Will, I don't know what I want. Let's go to Selfridge's or somewhere." Mr. Marble announced his contempt for Selfridge's to all Bond Street. "Women never do know what they want when they go into a shop. You go in. Just leave it to them. They'll do all the asking that's necessary once you get inside and they find out how much money you've got. You got your 50 all right." "Yes, dear." Mrs. Marble was sure of that. She had been clutching her handbag all the morning in terror lest she should lose it. "Right. Here's another 20. Put it away. Now in you go." Mrs. Marble, in the grip of a blind terror that made her knees tremble, tottered into the shop. Mr. Marble wandered thirstily away in search of a drink. When he returned, his wife was still inside, and he had to wait dismally for some time before she emerged, pale but firm and with a strange joy at her heart. She could tell him little of what had happened. Mrs. Marble was not clever at describing experiences, and it was hopeless for her to endeavor to enlighten him about the feeling of hopeless inferiority that she had felt when she saw the look on the assistant's face when she had to confess miserably to an address in the unenlightened suburbs south of the river, and of the condescension of the whole staff towards her, and of the unmoved fashion in which they had kindly relieved her of all her money and further allowed her to order a great deal more than she had been able to pay for. And how she had realized as soon as she was inside the door that her clothes were dowdy and that her hat, even with the new wing that she had bought the day before, was not, in the eyes of those aristocratic assistants, a hat at all. In fact, none of her clothes were even clothes in their eyes. She had realized, in a blinding flash, that these people mentally divided the world into the clothed and the unclothed, and to them she was on no higher plane than a naked savage. But she had made up for it. "I'm afraid I've spent an awful lot of money, Will," she said apologetically. "Quite right, too," said Mr. Marble. "They're sending the things, I suppose? Sure you gave them the right address? That's all right then. Let's go home." And home they went, in a bus crowded with the Saturday morning rush, back to Malcolm Road. It was rather unfortunate that when they arrived there, at 2 o'clock, there was nothing ready for them to eat, and Mr. Marble had to wait while his wife, with her brain swimming in a delirium of chiffons and serges, prepared a hurried and indigestive meal. The best thing they could have done was to have had their lunch out, but Mr. Marble had hardly thought of that. His old obsession had gripped him again. He was moody while on the bus, without a word to spare for his wife. He had been very anxious to get home to see that no one was interfering with that precious garden of his. This panic fear was displaying a growing habit of suddenly developing. Chapter 8. Next week kept all Malcolm Road on tiptoe. Various rumors had been flying round about Mr. Marble's suddenly acquired wealth, stating its amount and its manner of coming in 20 different ways. Yet there were still some skeptics who refused to believe the evidence presented to them and who scornfully declared that they would give credit to the rumors only when they were proved beyond all doubt. Why, only a few months back there had been similar rumors, when the Marbles started to pay off their bills and Mrs. Marble had bought some new clothes. But in a short time they had been back to their old tricks again, owing money on all sides, while Mrs. Marble had been going about as dowdy as any of them. But this time the skeptics were confounded. At first the news had flown from lip to lip, number 53's moving out. It looked like it, indeed. An empty furniture van stood outside, and men were moving furniture into it from number 53. Everywhere, from upper windows behind curtains, housewives were watching the process. Some, overwhelmed with curiosity, put on their hats and went thither on hurriedly composed errands of borrowing or restoring in order to have a word with Mrs. Marble to find out what was really going on. But they retired baffled. Mrs. Marble was in too great a state of hurry and bewilderment to give them any satisfaction at all. And, having retired, they were doomed to further mystification. For more vans drew up outside number 53, and from these men began to bring other furniture and take it inside. Truly, the neighbors were baffled. They had heard of people moving out before, and they had heard of people moving in. They knew of many cases where these two operations had been carried out as nearly simultaneously as might be. They had also heard, but more rarely, of people buying new furniture, although they were not newly married. But the present process utterly confounded them. And the furniture that was arriving. Nothing half as splendid had ever been seen before in Malcolm Road. They saw the great empire bed being carried in sections, the gilding flaming in the daylight, and the cupids, vapidly chubby, clustered upon it. The neighbors shook their heads sadly and told each other that they thought that bed could tell a tale or two if it wished. Then came chairs and dressing tables and chests of drawers, all resplendent in gold and covered thick with carving. There was little housework done in Malcolm Road that day. The housewives were too busy watching the new furniture being brought into number 53. The work was still uncompleted late in the afternoon when Mr. Marble returned from the office. It was nearly done, but the task that remained was the hardest of all. The men were busy arranging to get the vast mosaic table into the house. Mr. Marble, with quite a pleasant bubble of excitement within him, flung down his hat and hastened out to superintend the handling of this, his chiefest treasure. He stood by the gate, hatless in the sunshine, giving useless and unheeded advice while the workmen toiled and sweated, handling the monstrosity. Mrs. Marble had sunk down on one of the uncomfortable gilt chairs, quite tired out. As Mr. Marble stood on the pavement by his gate, he felt a touch on his arm, and he looked round. She was a woman nearly of middle age. No, hardly that, thought Mr. Marble, but at any rate gave an impression of ripe and luscious maturity. And she was dressed, oh, simply to perfection. She was dressed as Mr. Marble sometimes vaguely wished his wife would dress. Despite her closely fitting hat, anyone could tell that she was auburn-haired, and her eyes were a rich brown and her complexion was splendid. She wore her clothes in a fashion only achieved by her countrywomen. She was French. The whole atmosphere her appearance conveyed was one of ripeness and perfection, over-ripeness, perhaps, but that was, if anything, an added attraction in Mr. Marble's eyes. "What lovely things you have got," said this apparition. "I have been looking at them for ever so long. Those beautiful chairs and that lovely bed. They remind me of what I have seen in the Louvre." Mr. Marble was a little taken aback. He was unused to being addressed in the broad light of day by overripe and entirely delectable goddesses. But he was secretly pleased. It was a pleasant thing to have this long-coveted empire furniture admired, especially by people of obvious good taste like this one. Mr. Marble realized that the difficulty that the newcomer displayed in tackling the aspirate was not the one usually met with in Malcolm Road. He noted her as French, with a pleased appreciation of his own perspicacity, and his head positively swam as he looked at her and strove to make some reply. The unknown noted his embarrassment, was pleased, and went swiftly on as though she had not. "You do not mind my looking at your nice things? No? I am very rude, I know, and I should not, but I could not help it. And now I have confessed, and I ought to have pardon. You do pardon me, eh? Mr. Marble had not even yet recovered himself, and this charming little speech did nothing to assist in the process. He stammered out some banal phrase or other. The only intelligible word was charmed, but somehow the newcomer soon put him at his ease, and they were chatting away as though they had been friends for years. She greeted the appearance of the mosaic table with little shrieks of delight. "Oh, how lovely," she said. "It is magnificent. You are a very lucky man, Mr. Marble," said Mr. Marble. Upstairs, 3 doors off, one woman said to another, "The French dressmaker woman, you know, Madame Collins, she calls herself, has just got off with Mr. Marble. Nice goings-on, I call it, right in the street outside his front door, with beds and I don't know what being carried past them. I wonder what Mrs. Marble will have to say about that. Nothing, I don't expect. She doesn't never have a word to say for herself. He treats her cruel, so I've heard." But Mr. Marble for the moment cared nothing for tittle-tattling neighbors. He was too busy thinking of something nice to say to this wonderful woman. He was still talking to her when the table had at last been maneuvered through the narrow hall door, and the workmen were gathering in the background with a furtive lust for tips in their eyes. He paid them testily, and signed the forms they held out to him without even glancing over them. He did not want her to go away just yet, but for the life of him, he did not see how he could possibly detain her. Then came his wife, and this, instead of spoiling everything as he had feared, was the saving of the situation. He was not to know that Madame Collins' dearest wish at the moment was to scrape acquaintance with such obviously well-to-do people. She had noted the furniture, and she had noted Mr. Marble's well-cut clothes, just obtained from the best tailor in the city, and his platinum wristwatch bracelet and his gold cigarette case. They would be acquaintances worth having, she had decided. When Mrs. Marble appeared, she went effusively towards her. "Oh, Mrs. Marble," she said, "I've just been talking to your husband about all your nice furniture. It is too lovely. You are a lucky woman to have such nice things." Mrs. Marble was as startled as her husband had been 10 minutes ago. She glanced quaveringly at him, and took from him her cue of agreeableness. "I'm glad you like them," she said. Mr. Marble took his chance. "Won't you come in?" he said. "Then you could see them in the rooms. My wife could give you a cup of tea, too." "Thank you so much," said Madame Collins, and she passed the threshold, in more senses than one. They passed into the dining room. It was crammed unbearably with gilt chairs and the abominable mosaic table, whose tawdriness was accentuated by the faded flowered wallpaper and what was left of the dingy old furniture. With its glitter and glare, the room looked like a cheap Jack jeweler's stall. Madame Collins looked grimly round, but she was very charming about it, and praised the effect so delicately that even pale little Mrs. Marble flushed with pleasure. And she introduced herself in such a ladylike fashion that everybody felt happy instead of uncomfortable as they expected to feel. They had tea with the silver tea set on the gilt and mosaic table, a combination that annoyed Madame Collins' really sensitive eye extremely, and when she rose to take her leave, Mrs. Marble was almost sorry, tired though she was, and she eagerly accepted Madame Collins' invitation to call whenever she felt like it. Madame Collins had been very tactful and had let them know all about her past and present circumstances, without being too obvious about it. They had gathered that she was French, of a very old and distinguished family ruined by the war. Her father was actually a Normandy peasant, and she had married an English officer of vast talent but no money. Now they were struggling to make both ends meet, she with her dressmaking and he with his music. She admitted with a shy laugh that he really tuned pianos, but that was not at all the work he was fitted for. He had great ideas about what he could do, and, so she said, she believed in them too. To Mrs. Marble she conveyed the impression of a devoted couple with a great future before them. To Mr. Marble it did not seem as if the devotion were so pronounced. That goes to show what a clever woman Madame Collins was, even allowing for the fact that Mrs. Marble was very tired, and so preoccupied with being ladylike and pouring out the tea that she missed the 1 or 2 flashing glances with which Madame Collins favored Mr. Marble from her warm, brown eyes. And when she had gone, Mr. Marble, with his money scorching a hole in his pocket, was so excited and pleased with his inner thoughts that for the time he had no care about anything else. His riotous imagination had, for the nonce, something to riot over other than the possibilities of detection, and he made the most of it. He dreamed away the evening very pleasantly. He was not even disturbed by the fact that John and Winnie found it difficult to do homework on the mosaic table in consequence of the raised gilt border. He had no care for Mrs. Marble, who was patiently clearing up the confusion left by the men when they had brought the furniture, and who was toiling putting mattresses and sheets on the Cupid-encumbered Empire bed in the front bedroom. But he paid for this slight relaxation. He had to pay for it sooner or later, of course, and as it happened, this came about the very next evening. Mr. Marble was sitting smoking in the glittering dining room. He was still happy and peaceful. He ignored the discomfort of the Empire armchair in which he sat. In the hall stood a crate of books he had ordered that morning, crime books, mystery books. All the books he had seen advertised at the back of the limited selection available at the public library and had coveted during his poverty. And when he felt like it, he would leisurely unpack them and would arrange them in the drawing room so that he could browse in them when he would. But he was rudely disturbed. Mrs. Marble had come into the room and had sat down, and was fidgeting with her sewing in a nervous fashion. If Mr. Marble had given the matter a thought, he would have known that she was nerving herself to ask something of him, but he had been too preoccupied in thinking about Madame Collins and her brown eyes. The money in his pocket had something to do with it as well, and the natural result was that her request took him unawares. "Will," said Mrs. Marble, "don't you think we could have Mrs. Summers back here again now that we can afford it? This house means a lot of work for me, and now that we've got all this new furniture." Mr. Marble sat very still. His mind had raced away to all the books about crimes that he had read. He had impressed it upon himself so very often that he could only be found out if he made some stupid mistake, like the people whose unhappy lives were told in historic days at the assizes. He was not going to make any stupid mistake. Mrs. Summers was a harmless soul enough, but she had the usual besetting sin of charwomen, inquisitiveness. Goodness knows what she might not find out for herself. Or perhaps his wife would say something that would set her tongue wagging in the other houses in which she worked. It was only to be expected. Mr. Marble did not mind being gossiped about. He rather liked it, in the ordinary way, in fact. But he would have no gossip about himself nowadays. He simply could not afford it. He could foresee with vivid clearness what would happen. His wife would let fall a careless word or two, and Mrs. Summers would repeat them equally carelessly, but with a lavish percentage of imaginative detail. The woman who heard her would tell someone else, and before anyone could say Jack Robinson, there would be all sorts of tales flying round. There was plenty of gossip about him already. Thanks to the new furniture, any addition might result in disaster. Anonymous letters to the police, or a committee of neighbors coming secretly to investigate. No one would know, of course, anything about the real state of affairs, but Mr. Marble did not want there to be any suspicion, however baseless, attached to him. For his position was not absolutely secure. If the interest of the police were sufficiently roused even for them to make a casual inspection of all his financial arrangements, they might easily find something to interest them regarding certain banknotes that had passed into his possession one stormy night last winter. And it was not mere money that was at stake, nor comfort, nor even Empire furniture. What was in peril was his life. Much reading of books about crime had given him a good idea of the formalities of the condemned cell and of the scaffold. And he writhed in anguish at the thought. He could not possibly run any risks. Already in imagination, he was being torn from his bed one bleak morning and dragged fainting along a gray corridor to a tarred shed wherein awaited him a trapdoor and a noose. There was sweat on his face as he forced this picture on one side and turned to face his wife. "No," he said, "we don't want any charwomen in here. You will have to manage on your own." Even Mrs. Marble expostulated at this arbitrary decision. "But, Will, dear," she said, "I don't think you understand. I'm not asking for anything, I'm not really. You're giving me £9 a week housekeeping money, and that's a lot more than I can spend at all. We could have a maid to live in with all that money, 2 maids perhaps, with caps and aprons and all. But I don't want that. They'd be too much trouble. I only want old Mrs. Summers to come in 3 or 4 days a week and help me with the rough work. It's too much for me, really and truly it is." "What, in this little house?" "Of course I could do it if I had to, Will. But it does seem silly. doesn't it, that I should have to sweep and dust and wash up, when there are lots of people who would be thankful to have the chance to do it for me? And my back still aches from lifting those mattresses yesterday." "Nonsense," said Mr. Marble. Mrs. Marble was incapable of sustaining an argument for long. She had already made 2 speeches, each of them thrice the length of any of her usual remarks, and she could do no more for the present. She relapsed into unhappy silence, while Mr. Marble battled with the train of thought that had been raised by his wife's suggestion. His imagination tortured him with peculiar malignity for the next few minutes. Mrs. Marble's mind was working, too. That day had seen the arrival of the first of the things she had bought last Saturday, large boxes delivered by carrier, and full of the most delectable things her imagination had ever pictured. She had lingered over them lovingly. There were hats, wonderful hats, which suited her marvelously, although, as she confessed to herself, she did not much care for the fashionable close shape with its severely untrimmed lines. There were jumpers, matronly jumpers, which she realized with amazement looked very well on her, although up till then she had only considered jumpers as suitable for young girls. There were boxes and boxes of underclothing, whose price had horrified her at first, until she had taken heart of grace from the knowledge of all the money there was to spend. Naturally, she had not yet received the tailored costume and the coat frock for which she had been measured by a woman's tailor who had appeared startlingly in the shop as she finished her other purchases. Startlingly, that is to say, to Mrs. Marble, unacquainted with the commission-sharing system of ladies' shops and with the conveniences of the telephone. But that costume and the coat frock would not have been any good to her even if she had had it. Mrs. Marble had indeed roused herself to put on some of the underclothing, priceless things, warm and weightless, costing as much as her husband had earned in a month before all this started happening. But she had not the heart to put on a pair of the thick silk stockings while she had so much housework still to be done, and she wore over the wonderful underclothing her usual draggled house frock. With the other things arriving shortly, she might as well have put on her best frock, but she had not the heart to do that with so much washing up to be done that evening. Mrs. Marble felt aggrieved. Besides, she was tired, and her back really did hurt. A day or 2 ago, she had pictured herself sitting at her ease in the evenings, wearing a wonderful frock, with her skin deliciously thrilled by the contact of the silken underclothing. As it was, she wore a shabby frock, and there was a bowlful of washing up clamoring for her attention in the kitchen. It was this that roused her to surprising rebellion, very mild rebellion, but any sort of rebellion was surprising in Mrs. Marble. "I'll have Mrs. Summers in during the daytime when you don't know anything about it," she said. The words brought Mr. Marble out of his chair in a panic. That would be worse than the other thing. It would start gossip of a more poisonous sort than ever, and gossip better directed towards the real food for suspicion. For Mrs. Marble would have to tell Mrs. Summers that he did not like having other people about the house. He glared at her with frightful intensity. You mustn't ever do anything like that," he said, and his voice was cracked and shrill. His clenched fists shook in his agitation. Mrs. Marble could only stare at him, surprised and speechless. "You mustn't do it. Do you hear me?" he shrieked. His agitation infected his wife, and she fumbled nervously with the sewing on her lap. "Yes, dear. Yes, dear. Yes, dear. I don't want any of your yes, dears. You must promise me faithfully that you won't ever do that. If ever I find out, I'll. Mr. Marble's high-pitched scream died away as the door swung open. John had come running down as soon as he heard his father's voice at that hysterical pitch. It was not very long since the last time he had heard it like that, and then he had had to carry his mother up to bed, and she had a bruise on her face. John stood by the door with the light on his face. Mr. Marble shrank back a little, and his lips wrinkled back from his teeth. He was the rat in the corner once more. Hatred flashed from the father to the son. It was not John's fault, nor, by that time, was it Mr. Marble's. For James Medland, he who had come in that memorable evening, nearly a year ago now, was John's cousin when all was said and done, and there was a considerable family likeness. As John stood by the door, he was in the same attitude and in the same light as Medland had been in that evening when he had entered the dining room after Winnie had opened the door to him. No wonder that Mr. Marble hated John, and had hated him ever since he first noticed the likeness, that evening when he had struck his wife. Father looked at son looked at father. The room was all aglare with gilded furniture. The diamond in Mr. Marble's type-in winked and glittered as he shrank slowly back before John's slow and menacing advance. John had come to protect his mother, but the desperate challenge in his father's attitude had roused him to the limit of his self-control. It was Mrs. Marble who saved the situation. She glanced terror-stricken at her husband's snarling countenance and at the wrinkled scowl of her son. In utter fear, she flung herself into the breach. "John, go away," she said. "Go, quickly, it's all right." John checked himself and his hands unclenched. Mrs. Marble's hand was on her heart, for in that same second she had seen what her husband had seen long before, and she had guessed that it was this that had called up that ferocity into his face. She was frightened, and she did not yet know why. "Go, go, go," wailed Mrs. Marble, and then, with a supreme effort, "There's nothing to worry about, John. You had better go to bed. Good night, Sonny." When he had gone, silent, wordless as when he had entered, Mrs. Marble sank into a chair and laid her face on her arms on the gilded table and sobbed, heartbroken, while her husband stood morosely beside her, hands in pockets. The gaudy glare of the ornate furniture mocking him, mocking his hopes of the future, mocking his submerged, sensual dreamings of Madame Collins.